thanks for having me. And for those of you watching on an iPad, I saw some people on an iPad. This meeting is being recorded, and it may be a little bit small on an iPad, but you can watch it later on the recording. Is this size generally okay for most people?
Looks pretty good and readable. I
Okay.
don't
Yeah,
know how
that
others,
fits
any
in within the
idea?
1080 guidelines at least.
It's close to 1080. Um, it's big enough to show kind of my good code example. Um, let's any objections on this screen size? It's close enough.
Nope.
Okay, yeah, I'll say no objections then. All right, so the theme of the presentation is some bad code and some good code. And even the code isn't really completely horrible. That said, I do have some ways that I did things 10 years ago that I do differently and hopefully better. And I thought that would be kind of a fun way. And also just like, hey, nobody's perfect. Maybe other people down the road want to show some of their learning experiences. Um, so that's number one. Number two, inline questions are great. I'm going to try and, cover a topic and then pause. And I'd like to hear, any opinions. Cover the topic a little bit, move on to the next. Hopefully cover a lot. Most of the platform maybe. Um, and so feel free. Let me just put the chat up. I'm not going to be able to totally watch the chat, so anybody wants to stop me and say, "Hey, that was a really interesting question." Let's try and catch the questions in line with whatever I'm going to put on the table to
So Tony,
provoke a
you're okay with
conversation.
people interrupting you like me?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
I think it's going to be good because it'll put like whatever idea I'm going to put forth together with the better ideas that you guys are going to come up with. Um, so with that said, here's a system that it's more a demo. It's not really a system. It's just two files because we wanted to be able to demonstrate a portal. Um, we wanted to be able to demonstrate three possible visuals. The purpose of this was primarily to send it to someone that we're building a brand new system for and say, hey, let's talk about the visuals and try and get an agreement on the interface. Are we going to use kind of the interface we were using at that time? Or do they want to do a custom interface? For instance, an architectural firm is frequently going to want to do a very customized visual. Some of the other people that we talk with were like, yeah, whatever. Just give me something I can put data in and get data out. And so we tried to have sort of a decent basic. Um, Obviously, we're not going to agree on visuals. My joke is that, we'll have a meeting about user interface. We'll all walk out agreeing on everything. That ain't going to happen. Um, but we'll see some of that. But I'm going to show some code. I'm going to start with the relationship graph. If I was looking at a system that walked in the door and say, hey, we have a system and, developer went to pursue a musical career or something, can you pick it up? We would start by looking at the relationship graph. Um, so this is a very, like I said, simple. We use Anchor Buoy um, pretty much exclusively, even on a small system, because a small system can turn into a bigger system. Um, that's just what we do. So a lot of what I'm going to show is sort of based on uh, built on top of Anchor Buoy structures, table occurrences. Oh, just for the record, this is a table occurrence, even though it says table. I just want to, this is being recorded, so I'm going to say some things just for the record. Even though it says table, it's a table occurrence. Without objection, that is what it is. This is the relationship. Over here, I would call this a base table. I think that's the precise wording that I'd use. Even though it says table, I'd call it a base table because that what we have over here is different than that. And that's just a little linguistic clarification that's being recorded because I'm going to, put some thoughts out there for debate. Um, Couple things here. I did a little bit of color. This is sort of what's in the UI. There's a bunch of stuff that isn't really, we wouldn't necessarily put it. We might have a main menu and a resource table for storing globals. I think I'm going to skip that. We might have an account table. We might, if this was a big system, we'd have multiple files for starters. For demo purposes, we send out a single file. We're not going to send 20 files and just one file, have a look at the visuals primarily. We would, say, hey, there, might have an account table. We might have a file that tracks who's logging in and logging out. We use that a lot. If we have a customer and we want to know what operating system they have, what FileMaker version they have, what plugins they have installed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'll use all the get functions. We won't use all the get functions. We'll use many, many get functions so that we can, if we're planning a migration from, 18 to 19, let's say 19 to 20, we'll know who's got what, who maybe needs an operating system before they upgrade the FileMaker. So that's a helpful, that's a help us help you, or, you know, it's a lot easier than asking, hey, what are you guys running on your operating system? We don't need to ask. We just get it automatically from the session table. All right, so let's see. We do have a help request system that we like. This is resource that kind of goes up. That's the, what do we store there? Logos for the corporate identity and maybe an address. Icons in a big system, we'll use icons. In a smaller system, we might use what do they call them? Glyphs, which are two types, SVGs or PNGs. Um, Sometimes those are easier just put in, a lot less elaborate than the resource table. Um, we're doing this thing. This was a fun FileMaker fact, which is covered in uh, earlier presentation, DigFM presentation number 2. Command U. Um, we didn't do it here. We could do it actually as a demo. Command U, and then just throw some color in there. Do that a couple times, and it, in a very visual way, increases the clarity of what's going on. I'll do one more. Command U, throw some colors. We've never been able to come up with standard colors, but that's the relationship graph. Let's see, what else can we say? 3, this is like the little bears. And with the porridge, I think, is the fable. There's 3 different ways. This would be an opinion. I know some people like that. That's very tight. I personally prefer this one, which is kind of the middle road. That's like, I want to see what's connected to what. That's a little bit cryptic to me. That's a little bit like, I don't need to see that. It takes up too much space. It's just another decision to make. Over here, since I did my little spiel about tables, this is actually a source table, which is a base table that might be in this file or it might be in a separate, and they call it source table. So who am I to disagree in this case? That's about tables. I'm sure that there's a lot to be said about how people name their table occurrences. Like I said, anchor buoy. I like to do one column because things could grow. I think I'm more verbose than some other people, or other people that use codes. Maybe a reason for that. I don't think it's a bad idea. It's just I started with like spelling it out, and we do have a pattern because we do code gen off this string that's here, and the pattern is the name of the table, the base table, yeah, base table, the anchor table, followed by 3 underscores, exactly 3, because we can pick it apart. And then this is like a delimiter. This part is like what's connected. It's just an indicator. It's like a note, like a comment. Um, and that's how we name our table occurrences. And you can go up to 100 characters long. So we don't bump into any limits and we just spell it out all the way. Uh, so that's my story on, does anyone,
I had a question.
yes.
Your
Yeah,
your color coding, that those are the if it's the same color, they're the same base table?
yeah, it's, let me see if I have this here. I have it on the other file. I'll be back on this one. Uh, there is a keyboard shortcuts. Uh, I went looking for some, uh-oh. I know I have a note. Okay, I don't have a note in either one of these two files. So the answer to your question is there is a keyboard shortcut. It is Command U, and it highlights. Uh, okay, it highlights table occurrences that share the same source table. I hope I got that right. I probably got that right. So as you can see, this one says contact, and this one sits on top of contact. By the way, some people capitalize things, and that's just another way to do it. I like upper lower. Um, so if I go on this one, which is already green, so I predict this will be highlighted, and you can't see my keyboard, but I hit Command U, you can see that's highlighted and that's highlighted. And same, this is sitting on top of contact. I think kinesthetically, primarily, sitting on top of. You can see it says contact. You can see it says contact. And at least once I've done the whole color thing and noticed that the colors were not as expected. And I had, duped something and I hadn't changed the source table upon which it was sitting. So that was a good question. Hopefully that was a good answer. Any other words of any thoughts on the relationship graph before we move on to the next?
Something that we have been doing for a while, and that is the first table you create. The first time you create a table, you'll get a table occurrence. Unless you create a table with no fields in it, then you won't get a table occurrence. And so what we do is we create a layout. The first is it a layout? I guess the layout. Yeah, the layout is created, or I can't remember now. Like if you have no fields, either the layout isn't created or the table occurrence is not created. I can't remember which one is which.
So I just created
A table, no
with
fields,
no fields,
and then you have a
and
table occurrence.
I think
Yeah, you do. The layout is not created. That's what it is, I think. So you
that's
get a table
interesting.
occurrence, but you get no layout. But if you
Oh,
create a table,
that's interesting.
if you create a table with fields in it, then you'll get a layout and a layout with a layout created for that table
Okay,
occurrence.
so I'm
So
now I'm
anyway,
adding a field. No, I didn't know
yeah,
this.
but
This is interesting. Hold on. This could
but
be. Oh, and then if you add it later, then the layout appears.
yeah,
Okay.
and I don't remember if the fields automatically get added to the layout as well if you have that option to add fields to layouts. But what I'm saying is uh, we have a special area on the graph where we never touch those tables, those table occurrences. And so it's a long list of like, whatever the name of the table is, contact,
Yeah.
invoice, inventory, whatever. And then those layouts are associated with data layouts that have no fields on them in form view, and we put them in a folder called data, and we script everything such that we always use those data layouts for scripting, and then when we're debugging, we actually use some Scratch layouts. So we'll create another folder called Scratch, and then Scratch is going to be the same table occurrence, but with the fields on it, so you can see stuff
Yeah.
that's happening to your data. So when you're trying to debug something, you're pointing to the Scratch layouts, and you could write code that could actually navigate to the Scratch views because
Yep.
they're all named a certain way. So anyway, that's
That's
really
cool.
helpful. That's really helpful to us because Um, it just trims down on stuff that you really don't need when you're scripting. There's very few fields that you need to be on the layout for purposes of scripting, and
And
I'm
sometimes
blanking.
none is good. Like
Yeah,
the blank layout
yeah,
to
yeah.
get your
So
fastest possible.
yeah.
Uh,
So going back to the graph, that's something that we normally do. We just have a list of table occurrences tied to a single layout with no fields on it. And then whenever we need to interface them, we'll create a copy of that table occurrence and then we'll create some view to see that data. But we never touch
yeah,
those table occurrences and create relationships to them as much as possible.
okay, that's
Sometimes,
cool. I
yeah.
mean, we certainly we have a blank layout, so it's a little bit of a Venn diagram intersection. Um, and Vince, let's see. You reminded me when you're talking about the first table occurrences created something that I almost forgot to mention, which is the concept of a primary table occurrence, um, which I think I might have a good visual on. So there is, in my opinion, I think it's even officially called a primary table occurrence. The first for any given table, this is the file that I found that's going to have some better code, some of the improvements. It's a little bit busier than the other file. For now, I open this because it's got there's some code that'll produce this result, uh, except for the spaces, which I put in manually because I haven't whatever. Anyway, this is the first table occurrence base sitting on top of this base table, right? Table occurrence base source table. It's usually base table. But anyway, the file, that's the primary. And so I'll take file, I'll take script, for example. That's the first. And if this says script and that says script, that's good news. This is from the execute SQL. I'll go find that. I didn't invent that, but I'll drop that in. It's a good MI anchor buoy. And the test, here's a little bit of a test. If I go to this is a system structure. This is like extracts things with the design function. If I make a calc and I go calculation, uh, this is over here, right? At the top middle. That is, I call it the calculation context because it's easier than saying evaluate this calculation from that's a good name for it, calculation context. And if you're doing anchor buoy and you're mindful of what's the first table occurrence and you make it the context for everything, life gets simpler because it could be that, and then all the calcs get confusing. So that's primary table occurrence. Um, that's a bit of a complicated topic. I guess the short version would be take, let me don't save, take the table occurrence that they make and just be mindful that that's your calculation context. Um, so that's any other thoughts on
Yeah, when I create a new file, I don't necessarily need any fields, and it might be just the default fields that are created anyway, but I don't tie it to anything. I don't have any records in it, but I call it my interface layout. This is here where I put interface elements that I might use again and again. I've kind of designed it a certain way, and I can use it elsewhere. And I might even use that as my basis for creating the theme for the actual file that I want to use. That very, very first table that gets created on any new database becomes my interface.
oh, I
And
see what you're saying.
not really data. It's just a layout to store things that I want to put on it that I can use, but it doesn't need to be tied anywhere.
So Beverly, let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying. It's if I have a file, like here I have a file with a lot of table system structure,
Mm-hmm.
and the concept, if I'm understanding what you're saying, I should have a table in here called system structure globals or system structure.
No, it would be named whatever. When you build a database and you name it, you know, system structure, the first table you get would be called system structure
Okay.
because that's the name of the file.
Okay. Sure, sure.
If the file name changes later, that doesn't matter, but it's the very first table. It again, it may be default fields or, you know, you may remove those, but I don't ever have records in there. I don't put globals in there. I mean, I have other layouts for globals if I need, but this is just where I can put my interface elements that,
Okay.
you know, here's the style that I want for the header on each layout.
Okay.
And so then I create it and create the style and then, you know, add it to the theme, that kind of thing. But it's a visual way that I could copy and paste if I wanted to, or, you know, but it's a way for me to just design the style of the actual full database just off of that. Here are my elements that I'm going to
Okay.
use throughout on
Yeah, that
various
sounds very reasonable thing to
views.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, one of the things I've thought about in terms of files, we have some systems that are, 25 files, let's say, and they're all talking to each other, and there's a main file where the globals are stored and the same globals all over the place using that resource table loads globals and the globals show up everywhere kind of thing. And I've also thought, well, it'd be nice if I have like a module that's 100% portable so that if someone says, I want image management, and that's all I want, that you could just give them something that's standalone. I want taxonomy and nothing else. Um, but I like Beverly, I like that idea of a table in our email module. I think I have one of those. So that's cool. All right, anything else on let's see. So that's relationship graph. We're kind of crossing into layouts a little bit and also
If
into
I may,
tables.
if I may
Yeah,
add one more
Robert,
thing to your relationship graph portion,
please.
I tend to like having a dedicated portion of the graph for just cascading deletes. Even if there's none, I'll have a like a comment that says cascading deletes go here, because I hate hunting them down throughout the rest
Right.
of the relationships. And there's one more tool that I like for the relationship graph is it's called MonoDraw. It's a Mac product, but it's like Visio meets ASCII art. And if there's something that you need to put into a note, it lets you do some fancy charting type stuff.
Cool. Hey, Robert, on the first of the two things that you mentioned there, one of the thoughts that I'd had, I haven't implemented this, I've thought about it. It's if you're using Anchor Buoy, life is simpler because instead of the bi-directional awesome feature, I don't use it. It's Anchor Buoy because you're reading left to right. Is that right? Left to right for the most part. You can do something like this. So cascading delete dot D. Now, if I go here, I've got 6 things, of which 3 don't matter because I'm using Anchor Buoy. Everything's left to right. I'm not bi-directional, so I only care about these 3. So there's something that begins with the letter S, something that begins with the letter D, something that begins with creation, let's say. And by the way,
Yeah,
not the same thing as what you're mentioning, but sort of a tangential
yeah,
topic
it's
is
conventions, and if it works for you, that's fine. Me, I just don't like having to hunt all of the .ds
I'm not
throughout the
disagreeing with
whole.
what you're saying, not disagreeing.
Yeah,
I'm just saying this is just you made me think of something.
I
The
see.
the idea of separate is certainly and hunting them down. I think that's valid. I was just thinking like if I have a command D, that would help me in some way, or command D. And while we're on the topic, and I don't think we're going to get everybody doing everything, just pick and choose. The I think that I want to say something because I've just used a dot in a table occurrence, and Beverly's told me many years ago, lean towards underscores. I wanted to, you know, when we're naming FileMaker objects, if I put a period in a table occurrence, I think we always have to think about any character that I use that's other than a letter or an underscore. I have to think like, how are table occurrences used? And am I using a character? Like we see people with table occurrences like that or like that. And I don't think, I think that if table occurrences are only touched by technology that doesn't mind if we put a period or hash sign or a tilde, then we can use those characters freely. But if there's some technology where a period will break, it'd be good to know. That was a little bit convoluted, but Beverly probably knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but the point I tried to make, 30 years ago was that we've got those technologies now that are part of FileMaker. JavaScript, SQL,
Hold on, JavaScript,
XML,
SQL, right? Okay.
the stuff that we are using in FileMaker now just likes to puke when you put something
Well, I
in
want to know
there
when FileMaker's
that's a
puking.
there's a there's a leading underscore even it doesn't like it in SQL. There are
Unless you quote it.
workarounds, but
Unless you quote it.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
I mean, here's the thing, and I think
that's
Beverly and
why
I
it'll change. At
we're going
some
to agree to
point,
disagree on this a little bit.
at some point you'll regret that and you'll have to
Well,
fix
I'd
it.
like to look ahead into the future. I've had this debate with other people, and I think there's something that's safe, like tilde within a let function. Last I checked, that's not touched by external technology. The other one, and I'm going to, blame it on someone else. There's a gentleman out in New Zealand who says, custom functions, our leading prefix is a, shift two. I think that's called the @ sign. And I'm like, well, I think that's probably okay because custom functions are not touched by any external technology. Um, Healthy debate on that one. All right, I'm going to change the topic quickly. Retreat. I'm going to discard. See, I didn't even let that dot stay. So we covered anything else on relationship graphs? Um, all right, tables, base tables. I like singular contact instead of contacts because if you have activity versus activities, what is a record in this table? It is a contact. It's that classic question when you're doing data modeling, what is a record in this table? It is a contact singular. I've lost that discussion a couple times over the years. Life goes on. Layouts. Um, there's a gotcha I mentioned in a previous recorded presentation. If you have a table occurrence, this is actually a table occurrence, even though it says table, the table occurrence. I always name the layouts a little bit different. I'm never the same because there's a design function that breaks field names breaks. So have your layout never ever the same. It's just bad. I mean, it's not horrible, but it's bad. And I used to do contact double underscore or single underscore, something like that. Now these days I do contact and this little greater than sign. I like that. It hasn't broken yet. Um, if it's called by an FMP URL, it can be escaped or whatever. Oh, layouts. I tend to do detail list. This table, there's like the three standard things, right? The one they call form, I call detail. I'm losing a little bit, my little thing, I'm losing the menu, so I'm kind of half blind here. Yeah, here we go. View is form, I call it detail because I don't like the word form. I don't like forms in general, filling out a lot of forms. List view, detail list, my two favorite types, table. I have at least one of those. I tend to go to the trouble of making a list. Also, you know that layout that they make or that they give you for free? I tend to, as soon as that shows up, if I'm doing a lot of tables in a file, I'll just go to a previous and dupe something with a nice theme, midpoint, or whatever theme I'm working on. Just dupe and repoint and pick up, as much of the context as I can. Same thing with a list view. And then somewhere, I wonder in this, let me just look. I have a blank layout a lot if I'm doing any scripting. Yeah, I have a detailed list in blank, and then reports and whatnot. Um, anything on layouts? Scripting is going to be kind of where we're going to have the most lively debates. So, and that's coming up soon, as soon as we get past tables and layouts. We're almost there, actually. Scripting's coming up. Script folders. I once made a mistake of naming a folder, a script folder, identical to a table. I think that's what I did, and it broke. And ever since then, I do, I like this kind of underscore, like there's a folder, just so you get this kind of like, go that way. It's actually, that's what I put in, and they put in that. So it's like, hey, look over there. Pretty simple construct. All right, anything on that before we go to scripts?
Can you explain what broke? But when you said
Well,
you
it was
added a folder,
FileMaker 10,
uh-huh.
and I think it was really kind of obscure. I think I opened up a version of FileMaker 10 which preceded and in a file that had been touched by 11. And I think that layout folders came into existence in 11,
Oh,
and
okay. So
it was
yeah,
some really obscure thing. It
okay.
doesn't, and then, the whole problem goes away if you just name it differently. And also, obviously, be mindful of the client's version so that don't use the obviously easily, don't use JSON if they've got a FileMaker client
Yeah, but you
installed.
could get around that by just saying the minimum version to open this file is going to
You
be
can
19 dot
absolutely.
whatever. So
Yep. And yeah, and we had one customer, they're all paid up on their licensing and everything. They're a little bit, distracted doing this, that, and the other thing. And we had done a bunch of JSON stuff for them back prior to 16 shipping. And so we just went and refactored from the base elements JSON to the current. And they're on FileMaker 18 as of, I think, a year ago, about to go to 19, I think, or 20, I forget. Depends. They're moving the whole fleet forward. And point of the story is servers at 18, locked in at 16. We can code JSON without blinking. And Vince, to your point of there is the feature. Let me see if I can bring it up, just in case anyone here doesn't know. I am, because of the way I'm sharing my screen, it is, maybe I'm going to be okay here. It's like putting a pretty thick green bar there. It's under file options. You can set the minimum version. And I would riff on that to say, here's a thought that I've done is like on the concept of a front door, if you have a 25, multi-file system, 5 files, 10 files, whatever, the idea that when they go in the front door, I like to have a front door, the file that they're supposed to go through. And in that file, I might set versions that are allowed. Like I might say, you're not allowed to run 19.0.1. Just to make it a more granular thing, to take the FileMaker concept of like you have to run above this. I might be like, I want to make sure that you're running 19 dot, certain versions that have been tested. Uh, but I don't know. We're happily moving things forward. It's kind of fun to be able to use the more modern features, 18, all that file stuff, open file, write file, that kind of stuff. Good stuff. All right, let's think. All right, anything else on layouts or files or tables before we go to scripts? About to go to scripts here. Okay, scripts it is. Okay, I'm starting with the bad code. And I'm going to go here, Command A, and then an arrow. So scripts kind of includes the topic of script folders. It's a feature that I kind of missed a little bit. And by the way, this is the bad code. I'm going to refactor a little bit. So one of the debates, legitimate debate, conversation is how are you going to organize your scripts? And obviously more than one way to do it. We do it kind of three different ways. We have a lot of scripts that are based, we have at least folders that are based on the way FileMaker organizes their scripts. And in those folders are scripts that are kind of feature based and they branch. Let me see, I'm going to bring up an example. Go to detail. This one's a little bit busy, but this branches based on the layout that we're on. And this works well because it's anchor buoy. There's some other stuff here. But long story short, they, meaning Claris, has a collection of scripts called control. So if we have a script that's kind of control, we put it in the folder called control. They have navigation, we have navigation. Not original thinking here. So that's one way, not the only way, because we also have, sometimes we will have scripts that are table-based. Like if we have a lot of scripts that are, originate from the contacts layout, we'll make a folder based on the what do you call it? Based on the context, based on the table name. And I know that other people do things where they have like a folder for system and this and that. Let me think. That's basically, oh, we have one called work in progress. And then we have some feature folders like text editing. So it's either based on the FileMaker scripts, based on the table, like, we have a lot of context scripts, or based on the like a module, like well, here's one, the pick lists. This is all pickers. So that's the full script organization. And here we go. What do you all think about that? Different ways, different thoughts?
Uh, Tony, you were going to say this is the bad code. So what's bad about this code?
Okay, all right, let's go. Let's find some bad code. You're most kind. All right, here's a really bad, evil code. Okay, so here's a feature. And it was an innocent time. I wanted to have a button that I could click that would copy the field contents. Okay. This is a little bit over the top for starters. I think allow user abort. That would be quite sufficient. I think that was too much. That would fit with printing. That would be okay for printing because printing aloud, maybe I want to cancel and pretty up the layout. That's cosmetic. We haven't gotten to the evil part of the code yet. But while we're at it, this goes on param, so too much white space. That was silly. If zero, controversial, not going to give it up because then I can dupe these branches. Here's where the evil portion is. Now, on the surface, it looks, benign. It goes to a field. It pauses. This causes the field that I'm copying to flash. Nice little interface. It's like, oh, that's the field you're copying. And then it copies. And then actually I should allow the user abort off here. And I don't want them to kind of hit delete while they're in the field. So that's why I'm using the allow user abort. Looks innocent. All right, while you're thinking about what's evil about that, I'll tell you. The reason it's evil is because I have a purchase order table where the primary key, where I have the same field on the layout twice. That's one part that's evil. This is actually one of the better parts of the presentation, although I shouldn't say that. I should lower your expectations so I can exceed them. Here is a better copy script. For two reasons it's better. I started to use more and more object names. And this is, I would say, falls into a theme of black box scripts. because if I implement this copy on 3 different buttons, I need to go into the script and I need to add branches to the script. I need to touch this script. That's one problem. The other problem is if I have the same field on the layout, like the purchase order, this one you got to visualize because I don't have this in the demo. Imagine that I have the purchase order as the purchase order number and also as the primary key because I'm not handing them out sequentially. When I click the button, it's going to go to the field, but which one? So I could click a button in the lower left and it could highlight on the upper right, if that makes sense. Whereas go to object is going to be unique. If I have 2 fields, they're going to have different object names because they have to, because an object name is unique to a layout. 100% unique, not case sensitive, worth knowing. And this is a black box script. So this one, I have to put a button on a layout, and then I have to go to the script. So I have to write code in 2 different zones. Oh no, the humanity, the pain, the suffering. Whereas this, all I need is a copy button and a field with an object name. I don't have to touch the script, a black box script. So here's the evil one. Look how branchy, and this would just go on forever. Imagine if I wanted to add this to like 1,000 fields. This would be really long, but here, I'm done. That's it. Take a screenshot. It does have a subscript, which is a good subscript. We'll look at that in a second. Black box scripting, and this is applicable to a whole bunch of things.
I think if I can
Please,
interject
yeah, no,
one-
please.
So, because we have this debate quite often, comes up in different ways, and it's about how much do you abstract code? Where's the line that you draw to say, you know, and this is actually something that I remember from a presentation that Jason Young gave many years ago at a pause out of Pause in Portland, Pause FM, Pause on Air, and he was talking about what was it? It was the solution that seed code. What's his name? Someone remind me. I'm blanking on the name
John
of the
Sindelar?
John Sindelar, yeah, that's right. So John Sindelar and Jason Young, they were, I think, collaborating on some solution, and you know, and Jason said, you know, at some point, you know, like we could have written it so that it's, you know, this controller script, and then this is the CRUD operation script, and then it takes all the, you know, like it always takes these parameters and all that. But they said, you know, like we want it to be discoverable and easy to understand, and so they wrote it as like components, like, okay, this is create new project, and it's exactly what it does. It goes to the layout project, creates a new record, and there it is, rather than, you know, like some abstraction where, you know, you give it the table name by get
In
field.
direction, yeah.
Yeah, you get the table from the field using a field ID reference, so you pull the table out that way, and it's also nice and elegant for the person who invents it. But then, you know, someone who doesn't think that way has to grok at it for a while and
Right,
think,
yeah.
oh, yeah. So I don't know how many are like in the camp of developing that way. I mean, I've seen a number of systems where it works and then it ends up falling apart just
Complicated.
because, well, anything gets complicated over time, and yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but
Well,
I
Vince,
yeah.
if I may, I think this might be a good example. For the NYFMP, I wrote a blog post about deleting unused code. And if you get a system with a bunch of crazy code that's, maybe somebody walks in the door, is like, yeah, this was built 15 years ago and it's got like, 12 developers have worked on it and so forth. And you have all these layouts and you want to rename one or you want to delete one and you don't know what's used because they're doing the layouts are by name or by number. We will, and I think Vince is to your point a little bit. And I'm going to go back to the copy thing in a moment. We like to most of the time until we have a convention that everyone, use go to layout by reference. So I can rename this layout if I want to. Like if someone says, I don't like that name, or if I have a customer who likes to rename layouts, they can rename this layout. None of the code breaks because we're protecting it. On the go to on this black box copy thing.
I mean,
Uh,
you're protecting it, but don't you have a hard-coded string just above that if statement that
Yeah, the
says
worst
if
case
it's
scenario, is the button that passes a parameter. The parameter might say, go to layout, field or script greater than detail. And if I change the name, that same parameter might go to a layout that's been renamed. That's the worst case. I mean, it'll still work.
Mm,
It'll just have a linguistic mismatch. Not ideal,
yeah,
but it doesn't break.
yeah. Darren has his hand up, by the way.
Thank you for
Thank-
spotting that,
thank-
Darren.
Thanks, Vince. Start of this, Tony, you were talking about how you set up your graph, and you're making considered decisions on what you're doing. And that's what this presentation is all about, making a considered decision that I'm going to use this method to put something together. I'm going to
Yeah.
use a singular rather than and I'm going to use activity rather than activities. I think another consideration when you start a new system is the level of developer required to take over the system. Now, that can be on a scale of 1 to 10. Someone who's got 10 years experience, I'm going to develop at this level. So I'm going to abstract to someone who's got 10 years experience. So if you are no longer that developer on the system and you say to your client, look, the way this has been designed, make sure the next person's got these skill sets to move on, that they can look at abstracted code. They can look at some, more advanced concepts, and it's just considered. All of this, what you're talking about, is considered. Consider that. Don't let this in the hands of this sort of level developer, for that type of thing. And it's considered that you are using a certain function in the system. To Beverly's point before, she has a layout at the start that has all her elements at a central point. Now, that can include a big warning label: don't change layout names, don't change table field names, those sorts of things for the next developer to say, don't do these. Now, of course, you can use a DDR tool, base elements, inspector, one of the others, to say, this system does have indirection, so don't do that sort of thing. But the next developer may not know that. Another consideration, particularly when we're talking about abstracted code, is the ability to troubleshoot that code in or out of a production environment, so that you can say, this isn't working correctly, and this is a good method to troubleshoot it, that we don't have to touch the data to be able to troubleshoot the solution. And that can be a big thing, someone new coming into the solution to say, to troubleshoot this, you need to change a setting in the background that then says, I'm going to go to a developer table instead of the blank utility table to troubleshoot this script, so I can see what's happening in the data.
Absolutely.
So just as a yeah.
No, those all good points. And I'd say advanced points, not surprisingly coming from you, that they're very advanced points. And I would absolutely agree. We philosophically make a big effort to write code in the simplest possible way, even if it's a little bit more verbose. That was the example that with the layouts, branch, it's very brute force. And even the other copy button is a little bit super readable. I'm hoping, and partly because of this presentation recording, actually I had customer asked me, what happens if, you guys all get hit by a bus at the same time. And uh, part, part of the reason of this presentation is I'm showing you code that we actually use and have used for years. And it's being as recorded, I can reference it as a part of the training material. We also, I don't have it in front of me because we also have basic training materials for the code patterns that we use, primarily on the user interface, but also on the scripting level. Because I certainly don't want to leave if I get hit by a bus, A, that would be sad because I don't want to get hit by a bus, and B, I wouldn't want to leave people in the lurch. I think that's really something that everyone should think about, and maybe I want to go pursue my musical career, which would be
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
sad.
absolutely. Yeah, I tend to call it hit by a kangaroo. Just because there's
Okay.
less chance of being hit by a kangaroo than there is a bus. I don't want
By
to
the
bring that
way,
into my
just
universe.
as far as navigation, we do know how to do indirection, and I actually said, it's kind of like avoid indirection, and it's like, all right, I am so tired of like adding these branches for the go to layout in the script that I have somewhere that like adding this every single time. If the layout names, if I'm building it and the layout names they are, and and they say like this is the names of the layouts, or you code the layouts, please don't change them. This would work with indirection because it programmatically builds it. And this is a level of complexity up from what I showed before, which is like, I think it's more complicated, but not overly so. It's 37 lines.
But Tony, you can read it. That's the thing.
I've
Even
seen
though,
worse.
yeah, I bet we have. There's,
And by the way,
there is a comment.
sorry, one thing, I would, this white space, I would delete that, put the param, but go ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off there.
No.
Darren.
I'm just going to say that you've got a comment there at line 11 now. That it's very clear what it is. You can still read line
Yeah.
12 and see
Yeah,
what
line
it
12
is.
is where that's what we're doing. We're layout
Yep.
name, and then we're using, and instead of reference, right? Because it's strings versus reference. Strings is indirection, references, you can rename things. And then here we're going to layout, go to layout by name.
Yeah. But
Yeah, there we go.
again, your variable's called layout name. It's considered as to what it is. It's not a algebraic code or something like that. And
Well,
you're declaring your variables up early in your script rather than, within the actual function itself. I've seen stuff where the go to layout variable is in the script step, 100 lines deep in the script.
Yeah.
Give the person who's about to read this a chance to understand what it is. And
I
again,
think
set the level.
they got a shot. And this is the good code. So by the way, so on the theme of these black box scripts, I started to, I had a sort script with a ton of branches, and it's one concept that's applicable to multiple different areas. And I'm talking slowly because I'm trying to get the menu. No, I don't need the menu. I'm just going to do not data viewer debugger, the other thing that begins with the letter D. So I'm going to show you a sort script that is, I think this is a part of a recorded presentation for our friends across the pond in England, as opposed to our friends across the Pacific. That's Australia and New Zealand. Here's another example, similar. The old, and it's not bad, and there's a time and a place for this sort by active field, which should have a branch here, if this, if that. I have to say I wrote this. This is modifier keys. What if you're on Go? That's silly. But here's the one that I like better. I probably shouldn't show this. This one's complicated because it's pretty magical. Let me actually come back on that. I'm going to work from simple to complex. Let me go debugger. Okay, debugger. Find things that are the same. Okay, another black box script. Let's see how many lines it is. Let's decide to evaluate the complexity of the script by the number of lines. And if the number of lines is small, the script is not, can't be that complex because it's only 15 lines, right? So this is a script that, let me get something exciting here. Command J, okay, activity. I'm going to hold down the command key for that. I ran this on our current system. Apparently I have quite a few scripts in the activity file. There we go. Okay, so I am here on this one. I'm going to click the word activity template, and then I'm going to click this, say, find same, and it finds same. And if I go table view, find same. So same black box script, and that's kind of one of the key. I mean, this has been very good to me. That's why I'm showing it, because I think other people could make use of this. Because, just to repeat the benefits, it's a single black box script. And if I put, as long as I'm using object names, which are pretty lightweight, what am I doing here? At first I check the object name. I'm going to show that next because this is kind of a cool script. This line 4 subscript, I'm going to show that. That's obviously a script. Go to the object and then use this feature. If I make it 12 and up, find matching records. That's it. 15 lines. 3 of them are white. One's a comment. Actually, 4 of them are white. So it's like tiny. Black box script, and I just showed you it works. Applies to finding and constrain, because 3 different ways to do the find, right? Perform, constrain, extend. 2 of them are relevant to this. This is a simple, this is yet another one that's the same concept. Black box scripting for the win. Should rename the presentation. This is like does very little. It enters the find mode and it goes into the field. It does very little, but we do this a lot. Like, hey, I want to search on this field. I want to search on that field. I do that a lot. Don't know about you. So here's one that'd be fun to get feedback on. Object name, object. So this falls into the category of fail early. So at the top, if we're going to use an object name in a script, we're going to, try to not break our object names. We're going to, have a script that relies on an object name being there. Oh, look, I even have a bug here. Okay, that'll make it extra fun. Find the bug. Give me a moment. I'll tell you what the bug is, but do you see the bug? I see the bug. I made the bug. This is the bug. At least one, maybe there's more. This should be open quote, close quote, because let object names obscure, but if I open another file with the same name, it'll reference that first. So that's better. I'm going to leave it the way it is because I only have one, but that is a bug. Right, Vince, we've talked about this one, right? I think you might have pointed it out in a meeting. The design functions that reference the file.
Yeah,
This was, everyone should go watch all the previous videos. If you do open quote, close quote, it will, instead of the first file with that name, it'll reference the current file. So there's a time and a place for using it with get file name. Matter of fact, system structure is one, because it can either talk to an external file or an internal file. Open quote, close quote guarantees that it talks to the current, which is what you would want in this case. So here's the script. Define, you pass in the object name. You do this correctly, which I'm not going to fix right now. You set a variable for massive readability. This is another concept. Declare a variable prior to the condition so that you can kind of see what the heck is going on. Object name dot is, I use dot syntax because it's internal to a script. I can do that. And here's a dialogue playing around with emojis, single button. So if it breaks, it breaks. We're using filtered values. Could have used position. Don't use substitute. Case sensitive. Object names are not. I did that once. Filtered values is good. So that's a good, this is, We put that in every file. It's part of our fail early suite. Any comments on this awesome script other than it's awesome? Or bad? It's
Well,
not awesome yet, because this is wrong.
on my end, I have to say, like, this is more like a philosophy than anything else, but I hate halt script with a passion. Um,
Why?
so
Why? I think Clay built
why? Oh,
Because it,
I don't care who built it. You know, I just avoid it at all costs, right? It like
that. I'm calling
I'm
this as
almost
a
gonna say
subroutine.
it should not be part of the product, okay? But
I'm
that might be slightly too extreme, but I'd rather people not use it than use it where they think they should, because it kills the whole call stack. And
Yep.
if you have something where you've built your scripts, you know, and then you say, oh, I'm going to reuse that as a subscript, and then it's going to hand me back whatever I need. And then maybe in the middle of something, you're going to call a subscript, and then it's going to fail and halt and leave you hanging someplace you were not um, expecting. So that is why I will always use exit script and give back something else for the calling script to handle. And I think other than that, in what you've shown, I think the only thing I would change would be removing the case statement on the is empty, because is empty by itself is going to evaluate to a 1 or a 0.
Let me
And
let me go back on that. Hold on. Let me pick up on the first point. I just want you to know we sometimes use exit. These are scripts
no,
I'll get to next.
it's
We
that
sometimes
great.
use exit.
I'm not saying use exit. I'm just saying don't use halt.
Okay. So the reason we use halt is because if we're failing at the top before anything's changed, we haven't left the layout, we haven't changed the found set, we haven't changed anything at all. By halting, we can do something that's a single line as opposed to 3 lines, and it works. That said, nobody has to do it. The second thing that you said, let me think. You said 2 things. One, oh, if empty something something, and that was on the script we were looking at, which was the find object name, OBJ. I got to bring up the script to see the feedback on that one. Let's see, find with an object name. It wasn't that one. Hold on. The script we were looking at was one of these, right? Or was
it was
enter,
something
enter
about
the find mode.
is the object name on the layout, basically.
Oh, I think you didn't
So
like. Okay, hold on. Let me go look at the object name on the layout script. That's the val object on the layout. VAL. Object name is on layout or halt.
there you
What
go.
was? Yeah, what is it that you?
Line number 8.
Oh, you didn't
I
like.
would
We're
just
declaring it. We're declaring it before.
no, I would just remove the case. You know, I would just leave it as is
Oh,
empty and
oh, I
nothing
see.
else. So
Okay, if it's empty.
if it's empty, the thing, and you remove the case, you remove the 1 and the 0 at the end, is empty is going to evaluate to 1 or 0.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So we're spelling it out 1 or 0, and it's just 1, and if
Yeah,
that, it's
it's
implicit 0.
just
Okay.
yeah, it's just
Sure.
reading it. You know, I feel like it's a bit heavier
It would.
to
I
read,
think that's a
and that's
valid
it.
Hey
a
guys, it's
valid way.
Jerry here. Can you hear me?
Jerry.
yes,
Hey, how you
yes,
doing?
Jerry.
Hey,
Hey, Jerry.
I've got a comment to what Hobel said, and Tony, what you said about this whole, case is empty, case give a 1 or a 0 result. And I grappled with that a long time ago, because no question about it, it's more cool and more elegant to recognize the fact that you're going to get a Boolean result, and you make it shorter, you get rid of the case statement. That's all very cool. The only problem with, and this goes back to that earlier comment about you don't know who the next developer is going to be. I don't know what the percentage is, but I'll bet there are a lot of developers who, seeing a Boolean statement without a case around it, just look at it and go, why are you making this statement? Why are you saying is empty? Why aren't you asking a question, right? And if you don't know that you're going to get a Boolean result from that, for whatever you know, either because you're inexperienced or just because you're distracted and aren't reading it carefully. I've always been torn about that because I think it's much cooler to just offer a Boolean and
Right.
know that it's going to be a 0 or 1. But in terms of readability, which is, I know, one of the things you're talking about here, is any developer, no matter, you know, who has any kind of basic level of experience, knows how to read a case statement that said, you know, if this, then 1, otherwise 0. So
Yeah.
I can totally see your point of wanting to do it that way for readability, even though it is arguably not as elegant as just doing the Boolean.
So I think
obviously
everybody's
that's
right.
an extra function, obviously.
Everybody's right.
My point
Exactly,
is
that's
it is less readable this way because you really need to parse out and look at the actual end results, you know?
Yeah.
So and is empty is not a statement. It is in itself a question.
Right.
But like, indeed, if you have someone who's a newbie and doesn't know how the function behave, it can look odd. Okay.
Yeah.
And most likely it's going to prompt them to investigate around that and understand.
Sure.
And having like the case makes the overall calc lengthier with more parents, and you have to parse out more of what is happening here. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, I think it's valid points. Everybody's right in this case.
Yeah,
Either way works.
yeah, everyone's right. In this
And
case,
Darren, right?
Well-
This goes to like if you're handing it over to someone else. So Jerry's I'm going to referee here for a second. Jerry's of the opinion that you could say that this is more readable to a newbie developer. Robert, a more sophisticated developers, like, you know, people should be able to read it. Maybe it's more readable. Plus, if you understand how Booleans work in FileMaker, this actually came up in a presentation that I give, shorter presentation for the English, where like, oh, you could toggle the difference between blank and 0. But
Yeah,
let's move on
It's
to
like
the,
your if 0, you know, you're not writing if 0 equals 1, you know, knowing that it's going to evaluate to 0. But yeah,
some people like to
Yeah.
write the word true. I don't think we're going to get to a resolution on this. I think it was a
No,
good
I'm
debate. It's
just-
all recorded.
Yeah,
yeah,
Tony,
I
Yeah,
just
but
wanted to say
I'm with
you're
you.
flipping the context.
What's that?
You're flipping the context from line 8 to say if the object is not in the layout, it's going to be a 1. And then the next point to line 9 then says if the layout is not on the object. You tend to be flipping the context of what a 1 or a 0 is. This whole idea of is empty, and to create a custom function that says not is empty as a positive
Ooh,
and
that's a
negative.
good topic.
You know, so
Uh,
that's one point. Just to jump in on the halt script discussion, there was a time when if you ran a halt script step on a server-side script, you'd kill the scripting engine occasionally.
Ouch.
So
Okay.
I tend to stay away from
Has
it
that
for that
time
reason as
passed?
well.
Is that already behind us
I
now?
haven't tried it.
Okay.
But yeah, bitten in FileMaker 15 days.
So, no, I've heard we don't like the halt thing, and you know that's I think there's going to be a number of topics where we can, you know, debate it a wee bit and move on to the next because there's a lot to cover. I think these are all, you know, different ways of doing it. It's fine with me.
Tony, I don't think we're going to cover all of it.
No,
But
I mean, I'm
you
just
know,
saying,
yeah.
I think we should press on. I think we could spend, you know, I think we beat this one up pretty good.
I want to add one more thing because I think it's important, and that is you can still make this calc more friendly to somebody who's new, and that is you can add comments in line to the
Ooh.
calc, right? So you can nest the calculation so it has kind of a structured view to it, so that you know this is the section that is you know, so what is that line doing? So you put / at the end of the second line, and you add a comment like this is checking for, you know, blah, yada, yada, right? And then this is the default result is, the / on the second line where it says is empty, and you put it right at the end of the second line. So,
Yeah, I could.
You know,
I was
you
hoping
can
the
explain-
variable was pretty clear.
yeah, no, but what I'm saying is this is just a way to protect the investment in your code. Because if someone comes along and they don't know your code, and I think
You think
Robert,
they're
you
not going
presented.
to be able to understand this?
No, I'm saying like if someone is totally new, sometimes it's nice to have your thinking that you had when you did this, like, okay, so that this is the reason this is written this way or whatever. I mean, this is a small example, but what I'm saying is sometimes something a little bit more complicated, you might want to add inline comments, right? So that
We comment sometimes.
Yeah,
The
I agree with Vince on that, and the it's funny because sometimes I was thinking here you could just get rid of the case statement, just use is empty with the Boolean result, and then add a comment that says if it's empty, you'll get a 0 or what whichever direction you were going with that, and actually explain the nature of the Boolean result. So you're adding more text. You're not adding any more processing power to to run the function, but you have the benefit of explaining it while also making the actual function you're using more efficient. That's
I don't worry a whole lot about the efficiency. Here's a question for everybody.
Yeah.
When you're looking at code, how often do you see a script that checks for the presence of an object name on a layout at the top of the script? How often do you see that?
not very often.
We've got, moving along the same theme here, and here's a script that has very few comments as well. These are a lot, by the way, a lot of the comments that we do are external to the code because I think you could make a case that comments bloat the script, or I shouldn't say bloat because that's kind of,
I mean,
comments increase the weight of the code. And you could make a case that many core routines that you use could be documented external to the script because if I have a 25 file solution and I have these 8 scripts in every single thing, if I put comments, it's 8 times 25 times the amount of comments. And that it's all for the spirit of debate. How much comment is probably one of those classic debates that would go on for years. But thoughts on that?
yeah. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
And I know people feel strongly about this, and that's great. I mean, I'm stepping into the lion's den here with a bunch of talented developers.
I think we should get Ray Colligan in here and ask him how long variable names should be.
One character unless you have more than 26. Although Unicode, now you can use emojis, so there's 65,000, I guess. Yeah, Ray's written some great code. I think his variable names could be a wee bit longer. And Ray, if you're listening, I think your variable names could be a wee bit longer. Thematically, this is a more complicated script, and I'm just showing it to demonstrate that we have the ability to write scripts that are longer than 12 lines. This is falls into the category of fail early. By the way, try not to fail, obviously. Haha. This is something where we pass in. This is called, and it wouldn't kill me to put a one-line comment here, and I think elsewhere I have it in some of the more recent code. You pass in a field reference wrapped with a get field name, kind of a cool function, doesn't get as much action as it could. And then you pick it apart. And then if that field name here's one we use a lot, if field is empty, then halt. Like if we have a script that relies on the field, one or more, being populated, we will, what do we do? We'll check to make sure that it's empty or not empty or greater than 0 or not equal to 0. So that's fail early. And if you take a screenshot, you can type it in. It's pretty cool. And where would we use it? We would use it at the top of a script. We would fail before we go anywhere. And we would use a script step that begins with the letter H, that's 4 letters long. And we would kill the script
Tony,
right there.
Go back to the script that you just showed. So you just explained something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And about this script, right? And what I'm saying or advocating is that if someone were to come after you, that explanation that you just explained about what this script does is so important to be included in the script so that someone who comes here can see, oh, okay, that was your thinking. That's why you did this. I understand, but like if you just left with the code, then you have to grok the code. You have to
Right.
kind
In
of
other
like
words, you're saying there should be
read
a comment.
What I'm saying is, well, actually, I'm saying something much like I want to say something much more philosophical, which is two things that happened to me. A long time ago, I saw Mike Bostock give a presentation in San Francisco, and he's the author of D3, and it was a presentation with Edward Tufte and Mike Bostock. This is like over 10, 12 years ago now at this point, but he said something that I'll never forget. He says, I remove as much code as I add. And it's like, wow,
Good.
how do you manage to do that? Like, so like every time I add code, I'm always like hesitant to think about like, oh, that's more code to the project that someone's going to have to decipher and learn and support and whatever. So you definitely want to be very judicious in what you're adding, right? So that's one
Absolutely.
thing. And
We did an
everything,
infographic about this one in terms of
Yeah.
documentation. We did an infographic.
yeah, and everything takes time. So like
yeah.
if just if you have like a messy table as an example, and I have 1,000 objects on the table. If I want to I don't know, clean the table or whatever, every object has to be addressed. And so you pick up an object, you touch the object, you look at it, you say, what is this? Oh, this is a glass. So this should go in my shelf. Now you do that for 1,000 objects, there goes your whole morning, right? So what I'm saying is, it's just a reality. It's like, oh my God, unless you're AI and you can just churn through stuff like there's no tomorrow, and you can burn through like reading, a 10,000 page PDF in like seconds. You're not, but we're not. And so, yeah. So anyway, I just thought I'd
So
add that.
yeah, no, Vince, I spent a bunch of time recently deleting code and try and keep it. Einstein is misquoted as saying keep everything as simple as possible. And I never met the guy, but he
Yeah.
apparently said
Sorry. Yeah.
keep everything as simple as possible, but no simpler.
Yeah.
And
So David has his hand, and Darren
oh
has
yeah,
their
yeah,
hand up,
David.
'cause,
Thank you, Vince, for watching the waiting room. Oh, and Darren and David both. Okay, so David Head, come on down. Come on down from down under.
You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Oh, now you're muted. Now you're unmuted. We still can't hear you. I don't know why.
Yeah, I can't hear.
Okay, while you're sorting that out, Darren,
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with you, Vince. If you put the context of what that script does, it's going to give the next person a lot more understanding of what the script's supposed to do if you're giving them the context and what your thought process is. Absolutely. And I've just
Okay,
put
yep.
a note.
Comments are good.
A note. Yep. A note in
I
the-
actually
in the-
should
in
have
the
one
chat.
line up here that says what it does. Although I will say, and I'm not trying to, argue too much back and forth. The name of the script is a bit of a comment. I'm going to quote Jeff Atwood, who was along with the other guy. Uh-oh, hold on. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Sorry, I got a distracting chat. Jeff Atwood has a quote, and this is just for debate. It's all for debate, right? Or brainstorming or whatever. Jeff Atwood said, a comment is a lie waiting to happen. And that's a pithy quote. And, it's just good for
Yeah.
internet clicks.
Yeah. Yeah, Uncle
Um,
Bob's pretty much the same sort of mindset as well.
I like
know.
to try and make the script names, and someone could debate. I think one of nobody's going to agree on
yeah,
the code.
like
That's for sure.
in a sense, I feel like this moment in time is like the moment in time where, when they used to plow the fields with horses, and then
Are you
then-
thinking that
then-
AI is going to change the world?
definitely like like it blows my mind, like just that we're at a I don't know how to say this, but like
Tipping point.
when you think you know, like you look at these talks that people give like about technical debt and all this, right? And it's a real thing, right? And there's reasons that you know they pay attention to it and they try to mitigate it, etc. But there's other people I've heard this other guy talk not about technical debt but technical death, and that is where your code, so much of your code is so complex that you spend all day trying to make progress, but you never get anywhere, right? So it's like think about like you know the car comes along or the tractor comes along, and now it can do a whole field in 10 minutes where the horse takes like 5 hours or whatever, right? So the fact that like we have to grok this understanding is just gonna like you know get us to a point where we just can't keep up. We can't keep up with like AI to just basically come back to us and says, you know, you actually the script here is what it's doing is showing a dialogue, blah blah blah, doing this, doing that. And by the way, you have a problem on line 21, you know, and you would never grok that so fast as a machine, right? So what I'm saying is it's a losing battle. And then it's not like, you know, this is a AI.
I don't think
against-
we're going to lose to AI.
No, but what I'm saying is like the amount of code that you have to sift through and understand is like I wish I was one of those scientists that could write out those formulas like n to the -1 plus you know that much code. It's like it's just it's a mind-boggling thing when I look at
Yeah.
projects and I see the amount of code that's there. It just amazes me that we can make any progress on systems.
So
Just because,
Vince, on the
yeah.
topic of technical debt, when I when Scott Rose and his friend and I did the FileMaker Fanatics podcast, 5 episodes. We hold the record for the fewest number of episodes for a podcast. That's the first podcast was about the topic of technical debt, and I've certainly generated my fair share of technical debt. I mean, the title of the presentation is like, you know, I've got me in a dunce cap. And that's sort of intentional to say that I'm as guilty as anyone.
Yeah, we
I mean,
all are.
yeah,
I
I
would
mean,
say,
and I'm, you know, kind of showing hopefully
Yeah.
some things that are usable and some
so
things are not.
yeah, I just want to acknowledge David is back. Maybe he's
Yeah,
got
that's
his
good.
audio.
Hopefully with audio.
David?
David Head, are you back with audio?
You're muted.
I think I have audio
There.
now.
Yes.
You do.
Okay.
Wowzers. Okay, I held back my comments, but I held them back also because they didn't come through. Couple of things on this. One of them is I agree about the Holt script. Holt scripts are evil. Second thing, I agree about removing the case. I think there's no, if a novice developer doesn't understand what is empty returns, then they shouldn't be touching the file. And the third one, which is my comment about all of these scripts, the way you're using these parameters, and it goes in hand with Vince's comment about comments. I have developed a nomenclature for my scripts where the script name includes in square brackets at the end the parameter that's required for the script. So when you look at the script name, you know if it's got something in square brackets at the end that it will require a script to actually do anything. Sorry, it will require a parameter to actually do anything. So, and also what happens in there is that the parameter is named according to what it's being used for. So instead of just unloading get script parameter into a variable called param, I'm unloading it into a variable called action or a variable called layout name or a variable called whatever I'm going to use it for. So when I get further down, and I'm testing that parameter as a variable, I can see the variable name tells me what that parameter is about.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
no, those were all good. Halt evil. I think we can leave that for another.
Yeah.
And my joke was that Clay invented that, which was just a joke. The case, I think I'm tracking the votes on that one. The parameter, David, what I do with the parameter underscore P, because it's short. I have one script that enumerates the parameters that are called. I tend to just say underscore P because, scripts can be 100 lines at max. And I think the other point, and I hope I picked up everything that you said, all good points, is I've thought the one that for the object name, I've certainly thought of like instead of, using param over and over and over, naming to like object name, because that's what you're passing in is I think that's a absolutely valid way. To one of the things that I did recently, and this picks up, make sure no one's got their hand up, picks up on something Vince said on technical debt. We had some technical debt, and and literally part of my presentation is to kind of expose mistakes that I've made over the years, good code, bad code, because I like looking at other people's codes. So, by doing this, maybe other people maybe we'll get other people to show different approaches. I want to show you the technical. Let me show you something that's interesting and not horrible. Here's sort of an interesting concept. And since we do have a talented group here, this is, I'd say, is a advanced topic that I saw touched on. Okay, so what's the topic? On community, somebody said, have you ever considered instead of a single script step using a subroutine instead? And I'd been looking at something that occurs in the platform pertaining to set field. And so I've got an example here. I could set field, right? Instead of setting field, I'm passing in, and it's not JSON, it's just a string, which is I'm taking get field because I'm using the get field function, which takes a reference. So if I rename the field, it's very visible because it's not a string, it's a field. If I rename the field, it still works. And then I'm doing some text, and then I'm passing it, and I'm doing two, just to show it's one line to one line. I like shorter scripts, so I tend to use certain features that allow me to use shorter scripts, single line if possible. Well, not fewer lines. So this is a horribly written script that I was just demoing out proof of concept, talk to my coding partner. And the idea is that if you have a block of set, I'm sure we all have scripts that go set field, set field, set field, set field, set field. And you want to wrap that, you have a choice of either wrapping every single set field with a if this, handle. Or if you do it this way, I could set 50 fields or 10 or 5. And I'm like passing it in the way that could be done more clearly, picking it apart, and then it gets flipped around, and then we set field. Where's my error trapping? Set error capture on. I'm turning it on, turning it off. By the way, interesting concept. And I think David, had you have an opinion on this about, and this came up in a previous meeting. It's like some people set the error capture on the on and just like, hey, I'm turning error capture on. But I'm in the camp of like, only use it when you know what you're doing. Like turn it on, turn it off. Only trap what you know what you're trapping, and otherwise let it be noisy and learn something. Anyway, so
Yeah.
I'm turning it on. That was David Head agreeing. I'm sorry, I'm going to shut up because somebody's got a comment.
No, I have a very strong opinion on that, and that is my opinion.
Okay, good. So I'm turning it on, and then I'm setting field by name, and this works because what I passed in works. This is indirection, no doubt about it. That's indirection. And the reason I'm doing it, and this is kind of obscure, it's Steam group here, is that if I have a set field, I could turn on some validations, validate it's a number, validate it's unique, validate this, that, and I could have an error. And that error could be, I could have a block of 5 set fields, and the error could be on the third. But if I do it this way, I can catch the specific error on the specific set field. And I think I've said it all. And then my set fields are 1. I haven't done this in production. This was just, experimenting. And here's the part you're not going to like because it halts the script. But that could be exit and handle or whatever, and it sends a help ticket. So there's that, and that sends a Slack notification. But anyway, that's the complicated stuff.
But that one is okay because it's after an exit script.
Oh, is it? Where's my exit? Down here. Hold on. There.
Line 21.
Not anymore. Anyway, all right. I think we covered the halt versus exit pretty good. Anyway, so that's the thought. What do you think of that? Instead of set field, send it to a subroutine that gives you granular error reporting with a halt or an exit or whatever the heck you want to do.
Putting
As an
myself
example-
in the person who's following your bus. Sorry, I've just been following your bus, Tony, and I'm taking over your system here. And I look at this script, or I look at your previous script. I go, oh, that's cool. I'd like to use this script in my other scripts. Now, what parameter do I need to pass to this script in order to use it? And I would have to specifically go to the script and go through those lines 5 to 9 and work out what parameters this script requires in order to get it to work. And that's where the documentation is lacking.
Right. And I wrote this a few days ago, and this was all in the experimental mode. It came out of a conversation from one of the guys on Community. Doesn't matter who. He was like, hey, what do you think of this idea? And I posted this and I didn't get any traction, but I was just playing around. Literally, like, I think it was 8 days ago I wrote this, and this is just not at all polished. I will say, as I said before, that on the other one I was showing the if, I actually did like a full infographic on that. And as I said before, one of the thoughts that I've had is, where do you put the documentation? And I may be a little paranoid about how much comments I'm going to put into a script. I would say that it may be like, it doesn't matter. It's just a comment. It's a small amount of bits and bytes. I do think about, like, should I document this every single time I put an omit button on a layout, or should I have it in the documents that we do send out to people for the standard patterns that we use? The customers do get documentation with their systems. But that
My
said,
preference is inline documentation because it gets updated, and
you don't worry
because
about
it's
how much
directly referenceable.
You don't worry
No.
about how much
You
extra.
can put 100. You can put 100 lines of comments in here in the standard FileMaker. They come out in a different color. You don't have to be using MBS or anything like that to have them in a different color. Someone reading the code can totally ignore all of the comments if they want to and go straight to the guts of it. And also, it has absolutely zero effect on the performance of the script because the script engine jumps over any comments. So I far, far, far prefer inline comments to some reference to an external document somewhere that I have to go and find the page and find the documentation.
So
And
the script
to say,
engine jumps
Tony-
over. Does it download code?
No,
Sorry, what jumps over?
Does it download across the network?
No.
You're
No.
saying that
no, just
hold on. This is a question that I have for you guys because I don't know the answer. If you write a script with comments, when that script runs, does the script that runs, does it send the script minus comments over the wire?
No, it sends the script with comments, but the script engine ignores those comments
Okay,
and doesn't
so you get the
process them.
network, you get the network traffic, but you don't,
No,
it
that's-
jumps over the
there's-
comments.
There's very, very, very negligible network traffic from that. You're not talking about megabytes of stuff going there.
Okay,
And you
so you're
said
not concerned
earlier
about it.
you said earlier when someone pointed out something in the efficiency of something with case versus case and is empty, you're not worried about efficiency.
No,
So,
no,
I mean, that's
I'm
that's
worried.
a bigger that's a
I
bigger
think you made
aspect than sending a few more bytes.
Okay, all right. So, and someone else,
Yeah.
someone
Yeah,
else
I
had
just want to
yeah, please.
just to jump in there. Like David's in the bus behind you 6 months later. He'd like to use that script and take advantage of the great code that you've written. So he's going to go in and find out what's happening and use that script for another purpose. I'm in the bus 12 months behind David, and I need to troubleshoot why that script isn't working. And it might be your script or David's script. So I'm looking at that particular script. What should the parameter look like when it comes into the script? Now, one method is to put a comment at the top of the script. When you receive a parameter for a script, it should look like this. This is what you should be receiving. And in troubleshooting, you could then actually have a set variable at the top to define what the parameter is without calling the parent script, because you're trying to work out what this script is doing. Now, if you're 12 scripts deep into a child script from a parent, you're not going to be able to keep track of all the param that are coming in and out of these things. So if you give the context of what this script expects in the comment, you're going to be able to reduce the overload of someone who's going to be in David's bus trying to repurpose the script, and in my bus trying to troubleshoot it when it goes wrong and what it should look like when it's coming through. So at the start, this is what I'm expecting inside this script. This is what it should
So
look
I've
like.
seen that done different ways. I've seen it done, and by the way, just to show you a lightweight comment that we do, which is sort of, and this, it worked before. Hold on one second. Let me just do undo. I clicked on these two. I click on this button. It counts how many lines, and it makes a comment saying these 2 lines changed. That's probably the opposite of what some other people would do. It's very fast because we just write some code, say like we changed 2 lines. What did you do? We commented that out and changed it to that. Darren, in terms of the thing that you just mentioned, couple things. One, hold on one second. Oh, when you have a script with parameters, I've seen it done like 3 different ways at least. I've seen the idea that, the parameters that are expected into the script are in the script name itself. I've done that once. I don't do it as a general rule because it's 100 lines in a script, so you can't be consistent. I've seen the magical explode. I'm sure we've all seen that, where there's a custom function that magically instantiates a bunch of variables. I've never done that. I wouldn't do that. I don't know if other people do it. If you do, okay. I don't do that. What I typically do with fields that are coming into a script is just at the top of the script, I'll have set variable, set variable, set variable, set variable. And that block of lines will document in code, as opposed to a comment, exactly what is expected into the script, because it'll be a variable get parameter, and it'll either be like a JSON parse or back in the old days, 6 fried rice parse. I don't like the magical instantiation of variables because that's like a complicated custom function. Another topic, interesting topic. Speaking of custom functions, let's see. Okay. Let me show you. Here's something that's, I think, arguably interesting.
Also noting that we are at
we have time. How
2
much more
hours.
time before we wrap it up? Oh, have we really been 2 hours? Wow.
No,
Okay,
it's only 90 minutes so far. 99.
90 minutes. Sorry, that's 5:30. I'm thinking.
Are we targeting 2 hours?
2 hours is good, but if you guys get it more exciting by then I guess we'll just keep going.
I'm just trying to think.
You got to beat Keith.
No, I'm not going to go anywhere near Keith. Here's one that I think is a little bit of an interesting concept. And custom functions is the next, but this is arguably more interesting, and this kind of fits into the theme of like something that I did that I wish I'd done differently. I got a whole stack of those, including excessive use of the error capture and allow user abort that was spreading across the community a number of years ago before reason prevailed. Okay, what's the point? GTRR is we have navigation scripts. I'm sure we all do. We are using GTRR. There's a little bit of a conversation about stacked finds, but GTR seemed to work pretty good. Where these are non-optimized, they're not doing any of the fancy tricks of like gathering keys and putting them in a global field and this and that. These run fast enough. This particular system, by the way, is we call it system structure. It is an internal utility that we use that uses the design functions to extract pretty much everything that the design function can extract. In other words, scripts, well, you all know the design function scripts, layouts, fields, table occurrences, relationships, so forth and so on. It's not feature complete. I kind of ran out of steam on the relationships, but it's useful. And it's relatively big because the design functions do a lot. So you can kind of see field. It's also multi-tenant, which is kind of cool, useful. We didn't build it for cool, we built it for useful. Let's see, point of the story, very colorful. We covered that earlier. Okay. Oh, yeah. So there's a lot of navigation. So if I had a single navigation script, GTRR, I would have a really, 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 really long script. So at some point, I decided that I would be better off refactoring. And because we use Anchor Buoy, life is simple, and we can take what would be an incredibly long script and make it shorter by breaking it into pieces based on the context from which we're running it. So here I am I'm using layout table name, which works because it's Anchor Buoy. I'm passing in a parameter, which is a table occurrence name that's named according to a convention, so we can use CodeGen off it. And then because of Anchor Buoy, this is a string. This could be done differently. Because I have control of the table names, there's another way to do it, but works because of convention. A little fragile. If I rename that, it breaks, but I don't rename it because it's internal. And then it goes into a branch. So base table, let's do scripts. That's maybe, and then it's block. And this is all CodeGen. And there's a lot of different ways you could do the GTRRs. You could do GTR with a new window. You could do GTR. And there's even more with the card windows and this and that, but this is your basics. And that's what we do. And so the short version of this is would do navigation, and we have a calling script that's the script that's attached to the button 100% of the time. And from there, we branch based on Anchor Buoy context. And we do that mostly for GTR because that's the one that got ridiculously long. It could arguably be done in other places. Anyway, that's just a concept. And I bet someone could do like an entire 2-hour presentation just on navigation alone. I don't plan on doing it myself. But that's it, switch by context. Is anyone using this technique? It applies to go to layout as well. Useful?
I have no idea how you would use that script because there's no commenting on
No
how to
comments.
use it.
Okay. All right. No comments. That's the comment that's been made. Okay. Let me show you custom functions. I'm going to say that I think that custom functions is a little bit of a dog's breakfast. So I was doing custom functions. Here, let me show you a mistake I made. I built a help ticket system, and I was very excited about the help ticket system. And I put in a bunch of things that gets passed into the help ticket system using get functions, a little bit of design functions. And foolishly, I did not put the package of information that I was passing into the help ticket system. Foolishly, I did not put it in a custom function. And in hindsight, kind of the theme of the presentation, that was silly. And because a custom function is drier, and when FileMaker ships new features, and by the way, this is a bundle of information useful to debug a script, script ID, script name. When a new feature comes on board, 19.6. Robert, in your presentation, 19.6, right? Error line number or something? What's that thing called? There was a
You're
new
talking
feature.
about the error location, right?
Yeah, error location. I think that was
Yeah.
19.6,
Get
right?
into detail.
So if you were writing this code back in the FileMaker 12 and 14 days, which is when we were writing it, you would have that. So just recently, let me go find keyboard shortcut. Just recently, and then, by the way, not JSON, another feature that was not available at the time that we did this. But I took the script ID because we passed the script ID because the name can change and the help ticket system is durable. Like, go ahead, change the name of the script. We'll know what it is. Just did we need that? Maybe not, but we put it in there because we could using the features that they shipped. And this is the package of information, 6 fried rice. But now that I have it all in the custom function, I can swap this over to JSON now that our entire customer base is on 16 and above. Not always the case. Sometimes recent, sometimes big companies not moving fast. So that was the mistake. Custom functions to encapsulate complexity. This is complexity. And also to dry out the code because A, it's dry, and B, if I need to add that FileMaker 19.6 feature, I can add it one place versus a million places. And one more thought, and then I'm going to shut up for comments, is I did a little testing, and if I have a copy of 20, well, let's say 19 in this case, and there's a function that exists in 19, and I put it in a custom function, I can copy that custom function into a FileMaker 18, and it'll just return a question mark, but it'll be kind of future-proof. It'll work in the future. I used to think evaluate was a good idea. I mentioned it in one of Robert's presentations. In hindsight, I could just build the function in the version that supports it and copy it backwards. It just returns a question mark, so who cares? Anyway, custom functions, that was a mistake. The other mistake I made with custom functions, I don't know if I have any good examples. I think I overused them a little bit when I could declare constants in a script or let calc. But anyway, custom functions, any comments on that or anything? And 1030 is our target for, but anyway, custom functions. Anyone have any, the other thing I will say about custom functions, it's everybody writes them different. And that's probably not ever going to change. I'm moving towards a leading, let's see, Weet-Bix. Well, I'm not the only person doing it. Just the type ahead is nice. And also, if I'm in, another reason why I'm liking that is if I use this Monkey Bread, shout out to Monkey Bread, and I just type in @ it shows me all the custom functions that I'm using in the script because that's the unique character. And to Beverly's point, it's not an underscore, but I'm 99.9% sure that custom functions are only ever called internal to FileMaker, so I can use crazy characters without worrying about breaking SQL, or even the XML renders okay. And that's my take on custom functions. So I think we're kind of at the end of everything. So if people want to kind of riff off anything, I'm happy to I don't know, even hear about the next meeting.
Vince, a quick
Beverly-
question. Sorry, Vince,
Beverly,
a quick
I-
question on Inspector. If you're doing a
Yeah.
search for a custom function that has an @ symbol at the front of it, or any function with an @ how does it go? Because I know in base elements, you've got to encapsulate it in quotes or do something funky in your search to be able to find out symbols.
Well, we're using Logicator, so Logicator takes care of that for us. I can just check that out right now and get back to you, but I think it's safe. You type it in. I think Mark thought ahead about for that, and so I think if you're looking for a custom function that uses the @ symbol as a name of the custom function, I think it'll work, but I'll check and report back to you.
Here are some of the custom functions that I think were silly in hindsight, like a tab. I could declare a tab in the top of a let, or I could declare it within a script. It doesn't, I don't think it adds value as a custom function. And then it's just why, then makes my code less portable.
I think tab was useful as a custom function before we got the jar function, and then you could just declare it immediately.
Yeah, you could declare it in the script, and then you could, copy a script from one place to another.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it was only useful because we couldn't
I
actually
see what
write
you,
a
yeah,
tab.
no,
You had to sort of do an option tab in
and
quotes,
then you couldn't see what
but
it
now we
was.
can do a char 9. So
Right, and you know that you can read it. And before it was like, what is this white space? I can't see what it is.
correct. Yeah.
Okay, I would agree. So, I mean, I did that, and that was silly. Um, I also did, this was a little bit silly text. That was whatever. I put on Brian Dunning a thing where with the text colors where I use the hex instead of the RGB. It was fun to write. I'm not sure it's going to change the world.
Yeah, and just to comment back to you, it works just fine.
Cool.
Right.
One
Yeah.
thing about this UI, I would say, the
Uh-oh.
repetition of the buttons that are always on there. I don't know. We don't have the affordances that web developers have, like on row hover, show an icon or whatever. But I would say some of the things that we've done is like if you're going to show the same icon over and over, what we do is if you select the row, then you show those things. Otherwise, you reduce the visual.
You're saying
Otherwise,
these over here.
yeah, those and the
Okay.
ones on the left, and well, the checkboxes are just checkboxes, but the ones on the left, I don't know what the zero is. Like
Omit.
the zero is omit.
Well, it's a no.
Oh,
It's
I see.
also-
Yeah,
And
so-
hold on, let me just say that when somebody walks in the door, I fire up my correspondence generation and I send them 4 emails. One is 2.5 pages long. It's core features that we use in every system we build, which they probably don't read. 2 is here's a 1-page overlay of what a detail screen looks like. And 3, relevant to this, is here is a list view. And there's a little documentation of that is an omit button and what it does and so forth and so on. And they get that.
Yeah, anyway.
And that
just a
goes back to the
comment
same
that-
thing as like how much documentation am I going to put into a system? And how much am I going to have external to the system in some form or another? Good
Mhm.
debate. By the way, Vince, one other thing, because you brought it up, here's another mistake we made. Initially, I put the text to the right of the icon, and then I did what do you call it, multilingual thing. And then I discovered, big surprise, that different languages have words of different length. Who could have predicted that, right? And therefore, I began, you'll notice that the text is underneath the buttons here for that reason. That was number 1. Also, well, that's enough. Okay. Yeah, by the way, I think I've wisely stayed out of the user interface section of things because that would be 2 hours on its own. And I like, Vince, what you said about, have buttons that disappear depending. It's interesting. The omit, it's a little bit of like, if I click on this button here, the purpose of the omit button, by the way, is not horrible. It's, let's say I have 554 records, because I do. If I go here on a desktop, look, there's a little tooltip. And I hold down the control key and click on the number 13, it will omit that and all below it and show a found set of, what's that number? 12. And that's that. So the presence of that button, the visibility of that button is actually gives you a single click experience in that case.
Yeah.
Not disagreeing with what you said though.
Yeah, understood. Understood.
Uh,
I have a question about, and I don't know if this is how anybody has any ideas on this. You had a tooltip on there, which is useful, obviously, because if somebody doesn't know what it is, oh, good, there's a tooltip. Has anybody come up with a good way to identify to their users, to make it clear to their users, what objects have tooltips on them? So you know whether you should bother hovering for a second or two before it comes up, or whether to even think that there might be a tooltip there?
Good question.
I think, Jerry, some things that I've seen that are interesting is if you were to turn on like a help icon, or describe this layout, there could be like some overlay that you could, like a vellum paper that would
Right.
kind of mask everything, and you couldn't click on anything. And then you could put like little, markings to say this has a tooltip, this is what this does or whatever. But I mean, I don't know. That's kind of like, but I agree with you. There isn't anything out of the box.
Yeah.
Except when you're
I
in
don't
layout
know.
mode.
Right.
Yeah.
Jerry,
Yeah.
I would deprecate tooltips because they don't work on Go and replace them with I would consider deprecating them because they don't work on Go and consider replacing them with a popover, which is like this tiny little popover, which would work on Go. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, lots to say about the UI. I mean, going back to that list thing, I still to this day I can't believe that we don't have multi-select. Like every single app on the planet or the Finder, like if you have a list of files in a folder, you can multi-select different files and then move them to the trash or act on them or whatever you want to do. But in FileMaker, the only multi-select you have is a found set. Like I have to find the records that I want to act on, and then I run some process. And what I'm saying is, let's say you're looking at a list of students in your class out of 1,000 students in the school, you have your 20 students in your class, and you want to multi-select 15 of them because those are the ones that are going on the field trip. And so then you select the kids that are going, and then you run the script, say add to field trip. And you can't do that. You can't do that in FileMaker. You actually have to
Not built, yeah, not built in. And I don't have a rock solid implementation. I took a swing at it earlier, much as like,
Yeah. I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of us has probably done it, but it's never going to be,
not built in.
I mean, yeah, whatever.
A central spreadsheet functionality.
Yeah, exactly.
That would if someone did something along the quality of some of the stuff, what's that thing, the sorting thing and the finding thing that you guys did? You mentioned it earlier.
Logicator,
Logicator. Something like that, or the one that Mark, I forget his last name, did
Mark Scott.
pertaining to the button bar combo with the slide panel to replicate tab controls. Once somebody's figured that out, how to do a really beautiful implementation of multi-select, then we're in a better place, even though it's a pain in the butt to implement it because they ain't built in. But that's a feature that I have a partially completed thing. It's on my list of like something that I wish I'd completed and turned into a rapid deploy. But yeah, not built in. Sucks. Any other thoughts for any questions for anyone? Any questions for Vince on Inspector or Robert on do we have any French conferences coming up?
Yes,
do.
2 of them. One in Nantes, so that's going to be
Wait,
towards
not
the
That's all I got.
yeah.
That
End of
means
May.
where's not? Is that Canada or is that France?
No, that's in France, and then one in
Visually.
Montreal in mid-June. So yeah, I just want to touch on one more thing that Vince said about the guy from D3 saying he's removing as much code as he's writing code. So basically, there's two mindsets, that we always have. One is the mindset of the I'm gonna say the Boy Scout, right? To say, hey, I need to leave things better than when I came in. But the other mindset is also to keep your footprint as minimal as possible and not to disturb anything other than what you need to change specifically. So there's a very nice sketch that I'm gonna put a link to in the chat. It's about the Chesterton's fence principle, and it says, "Don't take a fence down unless you know why it was put up." So basically, sometimes you see some clutter and you want to take it out. Just make sure that it is clutter, because sometimes there's stuff that's there that's not necessarily harming anyone, and you can take it out. And sometimes there's stuff that's there that's not harming anyone, and when you take it out, then you realize it was used for something. So yeah, when you do those things, you just want to be sure that
You get negative points
you
for
know,
breaking code.
you know that it's actual clutter and not something that was serving a purpose, which is not always obvious. So
Hey, Robert,
there's tripwires.
one of what you're mentioning, I totally agree. This, as I mentioned it earlier in the presentations, this blog post that was done 13, 14 years ago, renaming FileMaker objects, renaming and deleting are in the same category of two different ways that you can break code. If you delete it, that's like really renaming it, and in order to, when I was working on a system that I inherited as developer number 4, it was a lot of indirection, a lot of technical debt, a lot of things that I was tripping over. And in order to do that, and it wasn't just one, it was like sort of happening quite a bit. I went and relatively methodically went through all of the different code objects and identified the script steps and the functions that would potentially break. And for that particular project, I went rather methodically through different functions. There were layouts referenced through indirection. I replaced them with references and so forth and so on, and all this big long list. And then I stripped it down and I deleted. There was 300 layouts. I deleted about half of them, and so forth and so on. And I'm happy to report that I can actually read the code over there now. So I actually agree, and I just, as a reference, I'll just drop this. It's a classic, and I got a lot of feedback. There were a lot of, it was a pretty popular post. I'm going to drop that there. So that was a good comment. Other thoughts here? Anyone for anyone?
You want to paste that link? in the
Yeah, I
chat?
gotta go find the chat. And then if anyone wants to download the, different people, different links, hold on, chat window. I will figure out where to put the chat. Oh, there it is. Okay. If you click on the 3 dots, you'll be able to get, I'm going to do that right now. You get all the links that people have talked about during the meeting. And I, for what it's worth, because we're doing the code, if it's AppleScript, we'll rename fields. And if they're called by AppleScript, first off, they'll say do not rename in the name of the script. That's number 1. Number 2, if there's stuff that we don't think is running, we'll put a little line, we'll have it echo into the help ticket system. And then if it does get called, like if we're wrong, we're usually right. Like nobody's using this. I'm like, I don't know. So we'll put a little, ping the help ticket system, and then a year later or a month later or 6 months later, we'll say like, nobody's called it since a year. So then we'll delete it after we run a DDR and a base elements or a inspector or a FM perception. After that, we will, then it's like, whoops, we deleted something we shouldn't. We can paste it back. We get a Slack notification, so if we mess up, we hear about it quick, and we tend not to mess up. Except 10 years ago, we wrote horrible code. All right, yeah, don't break your code. I agree. It's not your code to break. You get 1 point for writing good code and 10 points for breaking code. It's really unfair. So it was nice to see everybody. Jerry, haven't seen you in a while. Nice to see you.
It has been quite a while, yes.
Um,
Yeah, I actually didn't go to the conference this year for the first time in history.
oh, okay.
Yeah, hit the first 24.
Who went? Did you guys, David and Darren, did you make the journey from Australia? Or you had your own conference, right?
We've got our own conference we had our own conference in July, and we've got our own conference again coming up. There's an APAC conference coming up in September in Brisbane for anyone who would like to come to the sunny Queensland. That's reconnect.fm. If you can have a look at that. And there's a call for speakers out at the moment for that. But yeah, I looked at coming to Engage, and it was going to cost me about $12,000 Australian plus about 2 weeks of my time, so I couldn't afford it.
Yeah, it's a long way to travel, and the jet lag alone is probably pretty
Yep.
intense.
Our exchange rate is rubbish, so we lose. I could go and change $1,000. I'll lose $400 as soon as I do it.
Wow.
It's horrendous. You should come to Australia. You'd be millionaires.
Bring us some of that tourist dollar stuff.
Yeah, no, come to Australia. You'll get a lot of money for your US over here. A lot of value.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. Same sort of dollars for me to get over there. And these days, it ends up being a 2-day conference. So it's going to take us, almost a week to get there, and time frame, time zones, and all those sorts of things. So I'm looking forward to Brisbane for the new conference. Last year was really good. It was a really good 2 days. David and the rest of the team that put it together did a great job. So looking forward to same of the more of the same.
Do you get when you do your stuff down there? I mean, I can tell just from looking at the board that there's a lot of FileMaker action in Australia and New Zealand. And
yep, there is.
When you do your conference, I mean, do you pick up people from I don't know, Singapore, or is it mostly Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia?
It's last year it was just Australia and New Zealand, but we had a fairly short runway on it. This year we had we've got a much longer runway. We've sold a lot of tickets already. 6 months out from the conference, what's today? 3-4 months out from the conference, and we've already sold a lot of tickets for it. And Claris are trying to do a better job at pinging the people in Malaysia and Singapore and up there in Borneo to come down and visit. So we've also got a lot more people coming from around the world. Alexis Allen from Canada is coming down. She's confirmed. I think there are a couple of people coming from Europe and a few people coming from the States. So it'll be a lot more international. We've got some exciting updates. Claris is the principal sponsor, and we've got some exciting updates coming up about who's actually coming out from Claris. And I think as soon as that's announced, the ticket sales are going to go berserk.
That's cool.
Yeah, and also, Tony, thanks for putting this on today. It is not a tough thing, but a personal thing to open the Komodo, let everyone know what you're doing, and put your code forward for us to then, all get you in the corner of the ring.
No,
So
that's all good.
that.
No, I mean, that's all good. I mean, I knew we weren't all going to come to an agreement on every. I was joking with Vince the other day, and Eric, and it really a joke. I said, my goal for this presentation is to get every FileMaker developer in the entire world to write their code in exactly the same way that I do. Yeah, so anyway, purely a joke. But that said, I think that one of the challenges that we have like I'll give you an example. If we look at the awesome the current reigning champ of the FileMaker custom function website, right? And it's great. You can go there and you can find custom functions that fit what you do. Maybe you're going to, rewrite it a little bit to wrap your head around it. Maybe you're going to lengthen the variable names. Hi, Ray. That said, if you look at that in totality, you'll notice that if you looked at that website and those functions as a code base and imagine that was a system that you were called in to work on, you would be like, there's no consistency in the code. And I don't think there's a solution to this. My point is that, like, I don't know. The more we show each other code, maybe I'll add more comments to my code. Maybe someone else will add less, who knows. Anyway, I enjoyed the presentation, and thanks for Darren, thanks for the acknowledgement of the massive courage to show some of my horrible code. And I will say some of the code patterns are pretty cool. I would defend gently in a cordial fashion. I would defend the black box scripting. It didn't seem to be that seemed to be okay. So maybe you take the black box scripting, add one comment at top. One more thing on comments. It's I've seen the comments where people like put kind of like the story at the very top. I tend to like comment in line. But anyway, I'm going to stop talking because I think we've kind of covered a lot, and I enjoyed it, and I hope you all did too. And thanks for the invite.
So my final comment on that, in terms of what you do in coding, my advice would be do whatever you want to do, but be able to defend what you do. So if you use a halt script step, for example, I've got no problem with you using that halt script step as long as you can defend using that halt script step. The worst defense I hear from developers when I say, why did you do it that way? They say, because Tony White told me to do it that way.
That would be the worst.
Because Vince Monano told me to do it that way, or I saw a presentation by Ray Colligan and he said this was the way to do it.
No, that's not good. Make it your own. And I would just say, not to beat it up, but just to, it's just because if you do it at the beginning before you've changed your state, we have a line that's one line, and that's I just defended it. And by the way, I just did a code gen where I highlighted that and it made that comment, and that's lazy, quick, and dirty. It's like, hey, that's what I changed. 11 lines. Go look at it. Figure it out. Anyway, I'm joking around. Yeah, no, I'm very grateful to gotten everyone's feedback and a chance to kind of, collaborate with in a Steam group. I would do it again.
Yeah, look, I could also recommend. I don't know if you're still running your certification testing, David. That we don't have certification anymore. But the core part of the training that David gives is to say, understand the function you're about to work with. Go and give it a test. Do it more than the way that you normally do it, or the way you've been doing it for the last X number of years, and for some of it's, that's decades. And understand it. Understand the difference between. And David, we had this conversation about the order enter calc compared to a lookup. Understand what the difference is.
Oh, between the functions that do the auto enter?
Yeah. So you've got two very clear functions, an auto enter and a lookup. When to use one and when to use the other. Understand what the difference is.
Absolutely. Bread and butter.
Understand our platform. So
understand how when does the freeze window, or what is freeze, and what you said.
Yeah. When do you use refresh window and when do you use refresh object?
Yeah, and refresh portal.
Yeah, exactly. No,
sweet.
What's the difference?
Yeah, because you want to use the one that's lightweight to the task at hand.
And refresh your window and do all
Possibly,
the
and
expanded
sometimes you
data
don't
caches as well.
care.
Yeah, sometimes just hit it with the hammer, refresh the window, flush
Exactly.
cache to disk, and call it a day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
But
that's
yeah,
and
think
that's
more
a
about it.
perfectly good reason.
Yeah, you get through the day, you get it done. Most of the time, you have the luxury of being able to code in a way. The thing that makes me cautious sometimes, like we're building a system that's big, and big, it's 25 files, but each file is pretty, very robust. And only once we had one experience, a FileMaker Go app we delivered for a big outfit, and they kept adding features, and it sort of got to the point where they would have had to buy new iPads. The guy left and the project died, but not due to any of our faults. But when we're building something big, 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 I sort of worry a little. I try to code with a mind towards network traffic, maybe a little paranoid, maybe a little bit uninformed, which is the flip side of what you're saying. Understand the function, understand the platform. I try. I don't have Clay's home phone number. That would be helpful. But I try to kind of think in terms of like, if this gets really successful and they add more people, is it still, and even if like someone else looks at it and is like, oh, you're hitting the commit too many times, or you're not doing your transactions as efficiently. But anyway, I would just agree with like, the more you know about the platform, the more likely you are to write good code that's going to scale and last over time.
Those sound like beautiful concluding words.
Mhm.
Works for me.
So
Unless our hosts want to announce any future meetings or ask, what do you guys want to see next? That's what do you want to present, or what do you want to see? I mean, I'm not the primary organizer here, but Vince, Eric, Beverly. Was hand
Beverly
off?
had to cut out, I think. But
Yeah, Beverly had to go, but
yeah.
I believe we will have something to announce for the next meeting. So stay tuned. I don't have the topic right now, but I'm sure.
you have a speaker?
I think so. Yeah,
Who?
it's actually Beverly, but you can't tell her.
Oh,
Not until the day before.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see. We'll see.
You can watch the end of this recording.
Yeah. I thought we stopped the recording.
Whoops.
But yeah, those
yeah.
of you overseas, please come get down to Australia for the conference. It'll be great to see some of you down here. Return the favour that David and I have given you over the last, how many years, David?
You'd be serving shrimp
well-
on the Barbie.
During the prosperous years.
Yeah, we'll see who's still at the bar at 2 a.m. after travelling.
Oh,
across the other side of
you
the
don't want to
world.
have a drinking contest
Oh,
with the
yeah.
Australians.
David and I have had some great conversations at the bar at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Absolutely.
Been a while.
It's been a while indeed, Jerry. You should come down.
I'll think about it. All right, well, I'm gonna take it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks
I gotta
all.
go as
Thank
well
you.
too. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank
I'm going
you.
to stop the
Bye.
recording then.
Thanks, Tony.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Bye.